We live in a culture that is obsessed with blame and redemption, with villains and heroes, yet deeply uncomfortable with truth. When betrayal happens, especially between a narcissist and a super empath, we rush to ask who is right and who is wrong, who is broken, and who can be fixed. But healing does not begin with judgment. Healing begins with understanding. Not the kind of understanding that excuses harm, but the kind that sees beneath behavior and asks what pain is being acted out, what wound is being defended, and what nervous system has learned to survive by disconnecting from truth. Betrayal is not just a moral failure. It is a trauma response meeting another trauma response, with radically different outcomes. The super empath often walks away shattered yet awake, while the narcissist appears untouched, unbothered, even triumphant. And this illusion leads many to ask the wrong question. Why does the empath suffer more? The deeper question is why the narcissist cannot recover at all. Keynote 1. Betrayal exposes the narcissist's false self. Keynote 2. The super empath heals because they can feel. Keynote 3. Accountability is impossible without a coherent self. Keynote 4. Shame, not empathy, governs narcissistic behavior. Keynote 50. Recovery requires truth, not image repair. When a narcissist betrays a super empath, what collapses is not the relationship, but the structure holding the narcissist's identity together. Narcissism is not confidence, and it is not strength. It is a survival strategy formed early in life, usually in response to emotional abandonment, inconsistency, or conditional love. The child learns that being authentic is unsafe, that vulnerability leads to pain, and so a persona is constructed to manage the world. This false self is polished, defended, admired, and desperately maintained. Because without it, there is an unbearable sense of emptiness. The super empath enters the narcissist's life not as a victim but as a mirror. Empaths see beneath words, beneath charm, beneath performance. They respond to the wounded child behind the mask. For the narcissist, this feels intoxicating at first. Finally, someone sees me. Finally, someone stays. But what feels like relief soon becomes terror, because to be truly seen means the false self is at risk of exposure. Betrayal is not accidental in this dynamic. It is a defensive act. When intimacy deepens, the narcissist's nervous system interprets closeness as danger. The body remembers earlier moments when attachment meant loss of self or pain. Instead of moving toward truth, the narcissist moves toward control. Lying, cheating, devaluing, these are not signs of power. They are signs of panic. When the betrayal happens, the super empath is devastated because they feel fully. Grief, rage, confusion, self-doubt all surge to the surface. This is painful, but it is also the doorway to healing. The empath's identity is not dependent on denial. Their nervous system, though wounded, is capable of integration. They can say, "This hurt me, this mattered, this was real." Pain moves through them rather than being buried inside them. For the narcissist, the betrayal creates a different crisis. To acknowledge the harm would require admitting that the false self failed. It would require guilt, remorse, and accountability, states that threaten psychological annihilation. Instead of integrating the experience, the narcissist fragments further. They rewrite the story. They blame the empath. They minimize, rationalize, or erase what happened. This is not conscious manipulation alone. It is the mind protecting itself from collapse. Recovery requires the ability to tolerate shame without disintegrating. Shame is not the same as guilt. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, there is something wrong with me. For the narcissist, shame is unbearable because it connects directly to early developmental trauma. So rather than metabolizing the betrayal, they defend against it. They move on quickly. They seek new supply. They reinforce the illusion that nothing meaningful was lost. The tragedy is that the narcissist's apparent resilience is actually stagnation. Nothing moves. Nothing heals. Without truth, there can be no growth. Without vulnerability, there can be no integration. The super empath, though wounded, is forced into authenticity. The narcissist, though protected, remains imprisoned in the same defensive patterns, replaying the same dynamics, betraying again not because they are evil, but because their system does not know another way to survive. And each repetition hardens the false self further, making recovery not just unlikely, but increasingly unreachable. As long as the mask is mistaken for the self, and protection is mistaken for healing, and survival is mistaken for life, the super empath heals because they can feel, and feeling is not a weakness. It is a biological and psychological capacity that allows experience to move through the body instead of becoming trapped inside it. In a world that rewards numbing, distraction, and performance, the ability to feel deeply is often mislabeled as fragility. But from a trauma-informed perspective, feeling is evidence of nervous system flexibility. It means the system has not shut down completely. It means pain can be metabolized rather than frozen. When betrayal occurs, the super empath does not bypass the pain. They do not instantly reframe it into a lesson or suppress it in the name of strength. They feel the grief in their chest, the shock in their gut, the anger in their jaw, the confusion in their thoughts. This is overwhelming, and it can look like collapse from the outside. But what is actually happening is integration. The body is processing a rupture and attachment, and it is doing exactly what it is designed to do when safety, honesty, and self-awareness are still accessible. Empaths tend to have a heightened sensitivity, not because they are weak, but because they adapted early to environments where emotional attunement was necessary for survival. They learned to read shifts in tone, mood, and energy. They learned to stay connected even when it hurt. This same adaptation, which once made them vulnerable to narcissistic dynamics, later becomes the mechanism of healing. They can stay present with discomfort long enough for it to transform. Feeling allows meaning to emerge. The super empath asks not just what happened, but why it hurt the way it did. They reflect. They journal. They cry. They talk. They seek understanding, not to excuse the betrayal, but to make sense of it. This making is critical. Trauma that remains senseless becomes a loop. Trauma that is understood becomes a story with an ending, even if the ending is painful. Because the super empath can feel, they can grieve not only the loss of the person, but the loss of the future they imagined, the version of themselves they were within the relationship, and the hope they invested. Grief is not pathology. Grief is the cost of attachment, and when grief is allowed, it completes a cycle. It does not disappear, but it softens. It changes shape. It makes room for something new. Feeling also reconnects the empath to their body. Betrayal often causes dissociation, a sense of leaving oneself to survive the shock. But empaths are more likely to return. Through breath, movement, tears, and honest self-inquiry, they re-inhabit their physical experience. This re-embodiment is essential because healing does not happen in the intellect alone. It happens when the nervous system learns that the danger has passed, that the truth can be held without annihilation. Another crucial aspect is that feeling enables responsibility without self-destruction. The super empath can look at their own patterns, their over-giving, their boundary violations, their hope that love would heal another's wounds. They may feel shame, but they do not drown in it. Their shame becomes information rather than identity. This allows growth rather than paralysis. The empath's capacity to feel also restores empathy for themselves. After betrayal, there is often self-blame. Why didn't I see it? Why did I stay? Why wasn't I enough? Feeling these questions fully eventually exposes the lie beneath them. The pain was not proof of inadequacy. It was proof of investment. It was proof of openness. And openness, while risky, is also what makes healing possible. Over time, feeling leads to discernment. The empath becomes more selective, not colder. Boundaries emerge not from fear, but from self-respect. They learn to recognize when their nervous system is signaling danger rather than love. This is not because they stopped caring, but because they learned to listen inward instead of overriding themselves. Healing for the super empath is not forgetting or minimizing the betrayal. It is the gradual reclaiming of their inner life. It is the moment when the pain no longer defines their worth, when their sensitivity becomes a guide instead of a liability, when their ability to feel becomes the very reason they are no longer available to dynamics that require emotional numbness to survive. Accountability is impossible without a coherent self, because accountability requires someone solid enough inside to say, "This was me. I did this, and I can stay present with the reality of it." A coherent self is not perfection. It is not moral purity. It is the ability to hold contradictions without fragmenting, to feel discomfort without fleeing, to remain intact while facing truth. Without this inner coherence, responsibility feels like a threat to survival rather than an opportunity for growth. In narcissistic structures, the self is not integrated. It is split. There is a grandiose layer designed to be admired, respected, or feared, and beneath it there is often a dissociated core carrying early shame, helplessness, and unmet needs. These parts do not communicate honestly with each other. The grandiose self exists to keep the wounded self hidden. Accountability would require the bridge between these parts, and that bridge was never safely built. When betrayal occurs, accountability would mean acknowledging harm, tolerating guilt, and remaining emotionally present with the impact of one's actions. But guilt requires empathy, and empathy requires access to one's own emotional experience. If emotions were dangerous or ignored in early life, the adult nervous system learns to shut them down. In that state, responsibility is not processed as ethical reflection, it is processed as annihilation. This is why narcissistic defenses activate so quickly after betrayal. Denial, projection, minimization, and blame shifting are not strategic choices in the way we often assume. They are reflexes. The psyche is saying, this truth is too much. And without a coherent self to hold it, the system fragments further. Accountability is avoided not because it is inconvenient, but because it feels unbearable. A coherent self can say, I am not only my worst behavior, and I am not separate from it either. That middle ground is essential. Without it, the mind defaults to extremes. Either I am flawless, and you are the problem, or I am nothing, and must never look inside. Narcissistic structures are built on avoiding that middle ground. There is no safe place where wrongdoing can be acknowledged without total collapse. The super empath, by contrast, often has a more integrated sense of self, even if it is wounded. They can feel pain and still know who they are. They can admit mistakes without erasing their worth. This is why accountability, while painful, is possible for them. Their identity is not dependent on being seen as perfect. It is rooted in authenticity. Accountability also requires time. It requires slowing down, reflecting, and tolerating the discomfort of self-examination. But narcissistic coping strategies are oriented toward immediate relief. New attention, new supply, new narratives all serve to regulate the nervous system quickly. There is no pause long enough for accountability to emerge. The system is always escaping the present moment. Another missing piece is relational safety. Accountability develops in environments where mistakes were met with guidance rather than humiliation. If early accountability led to rejection, ridicule, or withdrawal of love, the adult learns that owning harm equals abandonment. In that context, responsibility is not associated with repair, but with danger. So the psyche avoids it at all costs. Without a coherent self, there is also no stable moral reference point. Values become performative rather than internalized. Apologies, if offered, are strategic rather than reparative. They are designed to restore image, not relationship. True accountability is not about saying the right words. It is about staying emotionally engaged with the consequences of one's actions. That requires inner continuity. The tragedy is that accountability is not just about others. It is essential for personal healing. Without it, patterns repeat. Relationships fracture in the same way. The same betrayals occur with different faces. Growth stalls because the self never consolidates around truth. The narcissist may move forward in time, but not in development. A coherent self is built through emotional presence, self-reflection, and the capacity to tolerate shame without becoming it. Until those capacities are developed, accountability will always feel like an attack rather than an invitation, and recovery will remain out of reach, not because change is impossible, but because there is no stable self yet to do the changing. Shame, not empathy, governs narcissistic behavior. And this distinction is essential if we want to understand why narcissistic patterns persist, even when they cause obvious harm. Empathy requires presence. It requires the ability to feel into another person's experience without losing oneself. Shame does the opposite. Shame collapses the self inward. It is not relational, it is isolating. When shame dominates the inner world, the nervous system is no longer oriented toward connection, but toward self-protection. In narcissistic structures, shame is not a fleeting emotion. It is a chronic, often unconscious state that formed early in life. It develops in environments where the child learned that who they were was unacceptable, too much, not enough, or only worthy of love when performing. Instead of learning, I made a mistake and I can repair it, the child internalizes, I am the mistake. This is toxic shame, and it is unbearable to hold consciously. Because this shame is so threatening, the psyche organizes itself around avoiding it. The false self emerges as a defense, not to dominate others, but to keep shame out of awareness. Grandiosity, entitlement, superiority, and emotional detachment are all strategies to stay ahead of that internal collapse. From the outside, this looks like arrogance or cruelty. On the inside, it is often desperation. Empathy cannot flourish in this environment because empathy requires openness. To feel another person's pain would activate the narcissist's own buried pain. It would crack the protective shell. So instead of empathy, the system defaults to shame regulation. Every interaction becomes filtered through one question. Does this make me feel exposed or protected? If exposed, the response is attack, withdrawal, blame, or dismissal. This is why narcissistic behavior can seem cold and unresponsive in moments when empathy would naturally arise. It is not that the narcissist does not intellectually understand that someone is hurt. Often they do. But emotional empathy would require staying present with that hurt, and staying present would mean encountering their own shame. The nervous system simply will not allow that. Shame also distorts perception. When shame is active, the world is no longer experienced accurately. Feedback feels like accusation. Boundaries feel like rejection. Another person's pain feels like an indictment. In this state, the narcissist may genuinely believe they are the victim, even when they caused harm. This is not always conscious lying. It is shame-driven reality distortion. In relationships with super-empaths, this dynamic intensifies. Empaths bring emotional depth, attunement, and authenticity. At first, this can soothe shame. The narcissist feels seen without being judged. But over time, the empath's emotional honesty becomes a mirror. And mirrors are dangerous when shame governs the inner world. The empath's feelings, needs, or grief can trigger the narcissist's buried sense of inadequacy, even when no blame is expressed. Instead of empathy, shame responds with defensiveness. The narcissist may minimize the empath's pain, accuse them of being too sensitive, or rewrite events entirely. These responses are not about dominance alone. They are attempts to escape the internal experience of shame. If the other person is wrong, then I am safe. If their pain is invalid, then I am not exposed. Shame also prevents learning. Empathy allows us to say, I hurt you, and I want to understand how so I can do better. Shame says, if I look at this, I will disappear. As a result, narcissistic behavior often repeats. Not because there is no intelligence or insight, but because insight without emotional tolerance changes nothing. The lesson cannot be integrated if it threatens the self. Another consequence of shame-governed behavior is the lack of true remorse. Remorse requires empathy and responsibility together. It involves staying emotionally connected to the impact of one's actions. Shame interrupts this process. Any contact with the harm caused becomes intolerable, so the psyche exits the moment. Apologies, if given, are often about restoring image rather than repairing connection. This is also why narcissists often seek admiration rather than intimacy. Admiration temporarily soothes shame without requiring vulnerability. It creates distance rather than closeness. Empathy, by contrast, requires mutual influence. It requires being changed by another person's experience. For someone governed by shame, being changed feels dangerous. Understanding this does not excuse harm. It contextualizes it. Compassion does not mean tolerance of abuse. It means recognizing that behavior rooted in shame cannot be healed through confrontation alone. Shame cannot be argued out of existence. It must be met with safety, awareness, and a willingness to feel. Until that happens, empathy will remain inaccessible. The super empath often heals because they are willing to feel shame without becoming it. They can sit with self-doubt, grief, and regret and still remain whole. The narcissist, governed by shame they cannot face, must keep running from it. And as long as shame remains the hidden driver, empathy will not lead behavior. Relationships will remain defensive rather than relational, and healing will remain blocked not by lack of intelligence or opportunity, but by an unhealed wound that has been mistaken for identity. Recovery requires truth, not image repair. Because healing is not a public relations project, it is an internal reckoning. Image repair focuses on how one is seen. Truth focuses on what is real. These two processes move in opposite directions. Image asks, how do I look now? Truth asks, what actually happened inside me and why? One is about control. The other is about surrender. In narcissistic dynamics, recovery is often confused with moving on quickly, appearing unaffected, or proving success after betrayal. New relationships, curated narratives, spiritual language, or apparent self-improvement can all function as image repair. They give the appearance of growth without requiring transformation. But none of these address the core wound. They simply build a new layer over it. Truth is destabilizing. It disrupts the story the false self relies on to survive. Truth says, I hurt someone I depended on. I acted out of fear. I avoided intimacy when it mattered most. These realizations are not abstract. They are felt experiences. And feeling them requires a nervous system that can tolerate discomfort without dissociating or attacking. Image repair avoids this entirely. It reframes betrayal as misunderstanding, growth, or mutual fault. It focuses on justification rather than responsibility. The problem is not just moral, it is neurological. When truth is avoided, the emotional memory remains unprocessed, The body does not learn. The pattern stays intact. Recovery becomes performative rather than embodied. Truth also requires continuity. It means staying with one's own story long enough to see the pattern across time. Not just what happened in one relationship, but how similar dynamics keep emerging. Image repair is episodic. It treats each rupture as isolated. Truth reveals repetition, and repetition threatens the illusion of innocence. For someone organized around a false self, truth feels like exposure. Exposure feels like danger. So the psyche chooses repair over reckoning. Fix how others see me, and I don't have to confront who I am. But this choice has consequences. Without truth, there is no integration. Without integration, there is no recovery. Recovery requires mourning. Not just the loss of the relationship, but the loss of the identity that depended on denial. It requires grieving the fantasy of control, superiority, or invulnerability. Image repair skips grief entirely. It replaces loss with replacement. But what is not grieved is carried forward, unchanged. Truth also demands humility. It places the self back into relationship with reality, with limits, with impact. Humility is not humiliation. It is accuracy. It is seeing oneself clearly without inflation or collapse. This is only possible when worth is no longer dependent on appearance. When image is no longer the currency of safety. The super empath often reaches truth because pain forces it. There is no benefit in pretending. The loss is real, the feelings are unavoidable, and the only way through is honesty. For the narcissist, image repair offers an escape hatch. But it is a false exit. It leads not out of pain, but back into the same structure that created it. Recovery does not begin when others are convinced. It begins when self-deception ends. Truth may cost admiration, comfort, or certainty, but it gives something image never can: coherence. And without coherence, no amount of repair will ever become healing.